Thank you, Jim. And good morning. And we are going to talk in our first talk this morning about the developing brain, how life experience alters or changes the brain. The overview, we're going to look at the brain, a little about the brain, parental and environmental influences on the brain, and then we're going to look at some media influence, what happens with the modern media and how it changes brain, spiritual influences, and then we're going to put it together how you can develop a healthy brain. So the brain is composed of over 100 billion neurons or nerve cells, has over 1 trillion supporting cells, the white cells that help the connections make and stay healthy, produces proteins that make the brain healthy. The brain has each neuron has up to 10,000 connections to other neurons, which means it's very highly interconnected with up to 40 quadrillion interconnections in the brain. It's soft like a banana, contained in the hard shell of the skull, which means it's subject to injury with rapid acceleration or deceleration. We call those concussions, head injuries. We'll talk more about that as we go through, but this has a significant impact on accelerating the aging brain. When we talk at the later today, the more head injuries you have, then the more you accelerate the aging of the brain. The brain weighs about 3 pounds, which is about 1 to 2% of the body's weight, but the brain uses about 20% of the body's energy. The human brain is so complex that over half of the genes in your body code for the brain. You think it's 1 to 2% of your body, 50% of the genes are coding for your brain. More than twice as many neurons are produced than are eventually used, and we'll talk about that process in just a second and why it's so important to be aware of that process. During fetal development, there's periods of time when 50,000 neurons are being produced per second in the developing fetus. At birth, from birth to the first 8 years of life, the brain is busy killing off neurons by the millions. Now, at first, this doesn't sound too good, but conceptualize this as Michelangelo's block of marble when Michelangelo gets it, and Michelangelo's block of marble when Michelangelo is done with it. When he's done, he has less marble, doesn't he? But now he has a masterpiece. The brain comes into the world prepared to be acted upon by education, experience, environment. Neural circuits which are exercised and used are not only retained, they're strengthened, and more neuron-to-neuron connections are made and built, and more complexity over time. But neural circuits which are idle, which are not used, will either not develop or actually will get deleted. And you think that through when you think about, this is a critical point as we go through the developing brain, because you're going to find that certain things fire certain types of neural circuits, which will cause those to expand, but others aren't getting used, which will either fail to develop or will be pruned back. There's a second wave of neurogenesis, meaning the production of a lot of neurons that peaks in girls at age 11 and boys at age 12, primarily in the part of the brain right behind your forehead, and then there's followed by several more years of pruning and restructuring. Anybody guess why this wave of neurogenesis hits right at that time? It's preparing for puberty and the development of secondary sexual characteristics. And so there's vulnerable periods of time when if certain exposures happen at these critical times, it can alter the developing brain. The white matter, which is the part of the brain that helps the signals go faster and neuron-to-neuron communication to happen, progresses from the back of the brain to the front of the brain, maturing or completing around age 25. And what this means is that younger adolescents will have their mood circuits developed in their early adolescence, but the part of the brain where you think and reason and problem solve and self-restrain, that part of the brain doesn't finish developing until you're around 25. And so when they would show faces to adolescents and ask them to identify emotions expressed in the face, the young teens activated their limbic or their mood circuits, where the older teens activated their prefrontal cortex. They would think about it. So basically they're saying young teens go with their gut. They just go with what it feels like. Older teens have this ability to stop and start thinking and evaluating what's going on rather than just reacting to it, because that's development of the prefrontal cortex. Let me walk you through a little bit of the brain circuits and explain to you a little bit how these circuits work together. And I like to use the analogy, we'll do that analogy later. Right now, let me just tell you some of what these brain circuits do. Prefrontal cortex, you can see right up here behind your forehead, is where you reason and where you think and where you organize and where you plan. The anterior cingulate cortex, Dr. Markham mentioned the heart. Well, the heart in the brain is actually the anterior cingulate cortex, abbreviated ACC. This is where you empathize, where you experience altruistic, other-centered regard, and where you make decisions in the ACC. In the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, where you reason and think, what would you expect? Connections to the ACC, if that's where you're making choices? Absolutely. Highly innervated between those two. The ventral medial, which is VMPC, ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and the orbital cortex, this is right above your eye. This is where you have a conviction of wrongdoing, where you feel a sense of inappropriateness, and also will try and redirect you away from acting inappropriately. So if you were to stand up in this room right now and try to take your clothes off in front of the rest of us, this part of your brain would start firing really fast, and you'd get really stressed, anxious, feel really uncomfortable, and it's trying to tell you, don't do that, that's inappropriate. This is the orbital and medial frontal cortex. The amygdala is the brain's alarm circuitry. If right now you hear a loud bang, boom, and you startle, and you get that adrenaline surge, that was your amygdala firing. Amygdala is also important in tagging things as being important and significant. Watch it, pay attention to that, that's important. The hippocampus is where all new learning takes place. If you're trying to remember right now and retain what I am telling you, it is going into your hippocampus today. And if you know anything about computers, the hippocampus would be analogous to RAM. This is working memory. This is not long-term storage, but it is the gateway to long-term storage. When you sleep at night, everything that you've studied or learned through the day that you retain will be transferred from your hippocampus into your cortex, which is analogous to your hard drive for long-term retention. Interestingly enough, many of the modern sleep medications, Ambien, Lunesta, these types of medicines, Xanaxes, Klonopins, interfere with memory consolidation. The actual physical transfer of things you've remembered from your hippocampus to your hard drive are impaired by those types of medicines. So you'll have about a 50% degradation in your ability to remember if you sleep with those medicines every night. And I have a lot of patients that come to see me, and they have sleep problems, and they're on these medicines chronically. And one of the things I've got to do is convince them to get off. And even if they sleep worse, which initially they always do because the brain is used to having this medicine around, you take medicine away, there's this rebound insomnia experience. And when we pull it away, I tell them, just prepare, you're not going to sleep as well. It's okay. We'll do some other things that won't interfere with this. But just watch and see if you don't not only feel better, have more energy, but watch your mind sharpen up. And it's amazing. I have patients 40s, 50s, 60s coming in. They're worrying. They're getting demented. We pull the sleep medicine away, and it's like, wow, I can remember again. So it interferes with this physical consolidation of memory. Some of these things do. So these are some of the basic different elements of the brain circuits. And we'll talk about their relationship and build on this as we go through the day. So what about the influences that help the brain develop? Well, there are two types of parental influences, the actual genes we get from our parents, and then the environment in which we were raised by our parents, behavioral and social experiences. And if you think about your genes and the tissues of your body, every cell of your body has the exact same set of chromosomes, which means that every cell of your body has the same DNA. But brain cells are a lot different than heart cells, a lot different than bone cells, a lot different than skin cells, a lot different than retinal cells. All these cells have the exact same DNA, but they don't look anything alike. What's going on? Well, this led Conrad Waddington in 1957. He began to theorize, hey, all the cells have the same DNA, but they don't look alike. There must be some set of instructions telling the DNA in the various cells how to express themselves so that a bone cell becomes a bone cell and a brain cell becomes a brain cell, and so forth. And that was termed epigenetics. Epi as in above, sitting above, genetics, the genome. And in fact, this is a whole new field of emerging science that we're just learning so much about, that there is a set of instructions that sit above the DNA that turn certain genes on, turn certain genes off, and depending on which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off, the cell functions differently and looks differently. Then the epigenetics, interestingly enough, not only do you pass along to your children the DNA sequences, you pass along the instructions that sit above the DNA sequences telling the genes how to express themselves. And those instructions are altered by the choices you make in life, by the foods that you eat, by the God that you worship, by the beliefs that you hold will alter how the genes are being expressed. It's very powerful. As you look at these two animals, how closely related would you guess that they are? Are these of the same species? They're both mice. They're both of the same species. Are they in the same family tree? They're second cousins twice removed. Are they close first cousins? Are they brother and sister, parent and child? Are they identical twins? Well, you think about that as we go through. This is a graphic simply trying to show you a little bit of the DNA and what the DNA looks like. The DNA is packed into chromosomes, and the chromosomes, we can start at this end. This is the DNA. It's a double helix, and the double helix is like a zipper. In order for DNA to express itself, the zipper has to unzip so the code can get read. And so this is the DNA zipped up. And you'll notice the DNA can be marked with, these are methyl groups. This is epigenetic marking. And depending on where methyl groups attach to the DNA, they can lock the DNA in that section down. It's like putting a little lock on it. You can't open the DNA here. This DNA cannot unzip. You could conceptualize it like getting a shirt tail in your zipper. The zipper just can't unzip with the shirt tail there. Well, this is what these little methyl groups are doing. And when this happens, the DNA in that section won't express itself anymore. And then the DNA is packaged or wrapped around histones. Now, the histones have these little tails that stick out, and these little histone tails can also get methyl and acetyl groups that can either cause that histone to express itself, that DNA there to express itself, or shut it down. So we can shut it down here. A couple of different places that the DNA can be epigenetically modified, turn it on, turn it off. And then it's packaged into chromatin and packaged into chromosomes. So a little about the DNA. And when we talk about epigenetics, we're talking about these modifiers that sit on the DNA telling it what to do. Now, let's talk about this. Fruit flies. There was a study done where they gave the fruit flies a drug called geldamycin. And this medicine, when they gave it to them, it caused these weird bulging outgrowths on the eyes of the fruit flies that got exposure to this drug. But then what was interesting is that those bulging eyes, these outgrowths on their eyes, were seen in the next 13 generations, even though there was no DNA sequence change, no mutation, and generations 2 through 13 were not exposed to the drug. What this means is that drug caused a DNA expression change, and not only did these insects pass along the DNA sequence, they passed along this new instruction to cause the eyes to bulge 13 generations down. They did a study of roundworms where they fed them a particular type of bacteria, and this bacteria caused them to exhibit the loss of a green fluorescent protein, and they look small and dumpy looking. No DNA mutation, no sequencing change happened. Remember, the theory of evolution is all about DNA mutation, altering which genes are mutated and so forth. No mutations are happening here, same sequence. But the epigenetics changed. And those epigenetics passed down 40 generations with no actual mutation that they had this expression change. And they were not fed the bacteria. What about transgenerational effects of food supply? Grandfathers who had short food supply conferred to their sons, their grandsons, greater risks of early death. And grandmothers who had short food supply conferred to their granddaughters greater risk of early death. No DNA sequencing change, no mutation, epigenetic modification. This epigenetic modification was specific to the X or the Y chromosome, were altered in the expression based on what they were eating, being raised in a place where they were in starvation or near starvation conditions. What about effects of smoking? Men who smoke before the age of 11 will actually increase obesity in their sons, but not their daughters. Because smoking before the age of 11 alters the way the Y chromosome is being expressed. No DNA sequencing changing. And when you pass along that Y chromosome to your son, you also pass along this new instruction that the smoking has caused your Y chromosomes to now have, and your son is going to have a higher risk of obesity than if you had never smoked. What about gestational factors? Smoking while pregnant. Well, I think most of you know this is not a good idea. It cuts oxygen supply, makes smaller babies, increases the risk of sudden infant death syndrome, causes learning and behavioral problems. The brain of the developing fetus develops different, so there's more connectivity problems and more learning behavior problems, and there's increased risk of psychotic disorders like schizophrenia and things later in life for kids whose mother smoked while they were pregnant. Alcohol while pregnant increases the risk of psychosis. It also actually alters the DNA in such a way. Now remember, there's no mutations going on here. This is DNA expression change, epigenetic modification, but it's altered in such a way that if your mother drank alcohol while she was pregnant with you, you will find alcohol tastes better than if she never drank alcohol. You would find, oh, that doesn't taste good at all. See, it alters the DNA expression of what you find tasty. It increases the risk of mental retardation. It causes multiple organ defects. If you drink enough, it can cause a syndrome called fetal alcohol syndrome. But what about one drink a week? Just one glass of wine a week or less. I mean, that's really not that big a deal, right? Well, not so. If you drink while you're pregnant, one glass of wine a week or less, your children will be smaller, with smaller heads. They will have more behavioral problems as they grow up, and they will have higher rates of delinquency in school later in life if you had one glass of wine or less a week while pregnant. They also have more emotional problems. So back to the diet of the mother. We're talking about those gestational effects. How closely related are these two? They're identical clones. These are identical twins. How can they be? They don't look anything alike, do they? What's going on here? Well, there's a gene called the Agouti gene, and in this picture you can see all these clones. And if the Agouti gene is turned on, then the animal becomes obese, diabetic, and has golden fur. If the gene is shut down and does not express itself, the animal is thin, no diabetes, and has brown fur. And you can see in between there's these different penetrants of how much the gene is expressed. It's mostly expressed here, but a little bit not. Partially expressed. And again, here you can see a lot of brown fur. So there's this different penetrants. It's partly expressed in some of these animals, partly not expressed. But you can see it just is a gradation. The more expression, the greater the obesity, the worse the diabetes, the more golden fur. Well, what turns on the Agouti gene? What makes this gene that contributes to such bad health problems turn on? Bisphenol A. This is a byproduct of plastic. I don't know if you heard, but the FDA just ruled this year that all baby products from now on have to have 0 bisphenol A. Up until now, I have the baby bottle on here because up until this year, up until this ruling, anything with plastics and fed to babies would have bisphenol A in it. And it would alter the expression of genes. Not gene sequencing. Gene sequencing is saying the same. But anything that you drink or eat or use that has plastics, well, that's not plastic, but well, why am I showing it? Because canned foods, all canned foods, they put a lining of plastic inside the can so the food doesn't interact with the metal and cause, some foods are acidic and so forth. There's not an interaction going on with the metal, so there's a lining of plastic in all the cans. Some of the new dental work are plastics, all have bisphenol A. So what turns off the Agouti gene? So, okay, if you had this exposure, bisphenol A, what can we do about that? Can we shut it down? Can we stop it? Well, we can, and that's methylation. Those methyl groups I pointed out earlier, you've got the gene exposed. If we methylate that gene, it will shut it down and turn it off. Well, so they gave these mothers who had the Agouti gene expressed and would have these diabetic babies with this obesity and golden fur. During gestation, they fed them a diet high in vitamin B12 and folic acid, which are methyl donors. These things give away methyl groups very easily. And guess what? The diet of the mother during pregnancy changed the expression of the gene so that those pups were born with methyl groups attached to the gene, which locked down the gene and shut it down. These pups were born without diabetes, without obesity issues, because the gene was shut down because mother got the methyl groups. Not only that, then the next generations, they didn't give diets with folic acid or B12. And the methyl group lockdown persisted for 3 or 4 more generations, even though the mothers of those generations didn't get the folic acid or the B12. So what are we learning so far? What we're learning so far is that it's not just the genes you have, it's how the genes you have are being expressed. And we're learning that the choices you make not only affect you, but they affect your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, passing down through the generations. So what about in humans? This was animal studies. What about in humans? Netherlands, World War II, did a study of severe food shortages and children born during the severe food shortage. So mom's pregnant, mom's averaging, I think it's about 600 calories a day during pregnancy, during the Nazi occupation in World War II. What happened for those kids is that all the children born in that condition had higher rates of obesity, metabolic problems, diabetes as adults. Why would that be? Well, think about what's happening. The baby is forming inside mom. Mom's in an environment where there's 600 calories a day to eat. So what kind of message is being sent to this developing child? Hey, there's a very, very fertile and robust world out there with lots of resources and nutrients for you, or this is a very, very restricted caloric world, and there's very little for you to survive on. So if you're going to survive, we need to alter how your genes are expressed so your metabolism can get rolling with very little nutritional input. And then what happened? Well, the war was over. Lots of food is available, but their metabolism now is epigenetically set. So they need less calories. And so they eat normal calories, they get obese, they get diabetes. What if mother is stressed while pregnant? Stressed while pregnant. What happens then? Well, mother's stress hormones cross the placental barrier, cross the developing blood-brain barrier, and actually interfere with the stress response in the baby's brain such that they are less capable of calming themselves as adults. And this is through epigenetic modification, the genes that control the amygdala of the brain, that's the alarm circuitry. This individual will be less capable of calming and breaking and slowing things down, so they're going to be more anxious, more nervous, more irritable kids, more moody, and more prone to mental illnesses like anxiety and depression disorders if mom was highly stressed during pregnancy. Now, this could be something mother had some control over, or it could be something mother had no control over. I have patients who husbands are deployed to Iraq and they're pregnant. Now imagine you're pregnant and your husband's a soldier in Iraq or Afghanistan or some of this situation. Or your husband gets killed in a car wreck while you're pregnant. There's lots and lots of reasons why people can have stress that they have no power over. But it doesn't matter if you're highly stressed during pregnancy, you're going to release those glucocorticoids. Those glucocorticoids are going to cross through the placental barrier. They're going to be altering the developing brain. Do you see the benefit and the reason of living a peaceful life? Yeah. What about mother's intake of mercury and fish oil? Well, a study of 400 children over 8 years found that children of mothers with mercury levels of 1 microgram per gram had higher rates of attention deficit disorder, but children of mothers who ate fish twice per week had lower rates of attention deficit disorder. We'll talk about omega-3 fatty acids and fish oils in many lectures today, but omega-3 fatty acids, fish oils are essential nutrients the brain requires, but the brain can't make it. Providing those nutrients increase IQ, decrease inflammation, help neuronal development, and basically provide better brain health. What about parental environmental factors? First, let's look at the animal studies. They took pups of mothers who were nurturing and licking and grooming, these types of mothers that would do this to their pups, and compared them to pups of mothers who were neglect mothers. They wouldn't nurture their pups. They wouldn't groom them. They wouldn't lick them. And they compared the pups of these two types of mothers, and they discovered that the pups without attentive mothers had altered brain development, so they had overreactive alarm circuitry, and they were socially impaired because they were nervous, they were apprehensive, they wouldn't interact with others, they would shy away. And they lived this fearful, apprehensive life because they weren't groomed and licked. Well, maybe it's genetic, right? Maybe it's that mom has just got this problem too, and it's not really environment, it's genes, right? Well, they took the pups of neglect mothers, and they put them in with the pups that were nurturing the mothers that were nurturing, and let them be raised by the nurturing mothers, and guess what? The brains developed normally, no increased irritability of the amygdala. So it wasn't the genetics, it was actually the environment was altering how the brain was being developed. Child abuse and gene expression in brain tissue. 41 Canadian men were evaluated, 29 with severe abuse, 16 controls, and they discovered that the DNA from the hippocampal neurons, remember hippocampal neurons where you remember and learn, it's like your RAM in your computer. They looked at the DNA there and they found that there were 362 epigenetic changes. There were 248 genes that were turned off, and there were 114 that were hypomethylated. So some had methyl groups attached, some should have had methyl groups, and the methyl groups were removed. 362 gene expression changes based on experiencing abuse in childhood in just this one part of the brain. Environment alters how the brain is developed. The most significant effects were on the genes which regulated neuroplasticity. And what neuroplasticity means is the ability of the brain to grow and change and adapt to environment and new experience. And so these genes were being affected, so these brains were becoming less adaptable, more rigid, less capable of changing based on positive experiences, because of the abuse experiences they went through. So what happens to the brain in abuse environments? What happens to the brain in abuse environments is that the amygdala, the fear circuitry, is firing constantly. But what's happening in the prefrontal cortex circuitry where you think? Let me give you an example. I want you to imagine that you believe that at any moment, somebody could come in here and beat you severely. You believe any second somebody's going to come here and break in here and beat you or rape you. It could happen any second. You believe this right now. And you've got to go take your final exams in school with that threat hanging over your head. Do you think your exam scores will be affected? Well, you've got a developed brain. Think about a child with an undeveloped brain who lives in a home. At any moment, daddy can come in and beat them severely or molest them, or mommy can come in and beat them. They live under this constant threat day in, day out. They get this terrible upregulation of their fear circuitry, which impairs the developing of their prefrontal cortex circuitry. So not only do they come into adulthood with distortions about themselves, belief systems that are altered, fear of relationships, lack of trust in people, they come with brains that are out of balance, where they're much more moody, much more irritable, much more apprehensive, much more fearful, and less capable of working those issues through, which we will discuss further in our lecture on depression this afternoon. So what if the amygdala keeps firing and doesn't stop? Well, what happens is this activates your sympathetic nervous system, which in your body tells macrophages, these are white blood cells, to kick on and begin releasing inflammatory factors. These are these cytokines. These are inflammatory factors, and we will develop this some more as we go through the day as well, pick the detail up one at a time. And those inflammatory factors are damaging to your body. They damage the glucocorticoid receptors in your hippocampus. They damage insulin receptors in your body. Now think this through. Insulin receptors being damaged become less responsive, so they're not working as well in the face of insulin, and this is happening in the face of high stress. And under high stress, what does your body do? It dumps glucose into your bloodstream because you need energy for fight or flight. And so glucose is getting dumped in, but chronic stress is impairing insulin receptors. Guess what this leads to? Obesity, diabetes, the risk of ischemic heart attack, strokes, all coming out of a sympathetic nervous, a brain that can't relax, the alarm circuitry firing constantly, leading to this inflammatory cascade. It also interferes with synaptic signaling, these inflammatory factors do. So if I were to just take a syringe, just a syringe, a few cc's of these inflammatory factors and inject them into you, within a couple of hours, you're going to start feeling aches and pains all over your body. You're going to have concentration impairments, loss of appetite, sleep disturbance, fatigue, and malaise. What does that sound like? These are symptoms of depression. And as we talk this afternoon, you'll notice I will walk you back through some of this in greater detail, because when people are depressed, they have this inflammatory cascade going along. This was a study. It was a very powerful study because it was a prospective study, 32-year prospective study. And what that means is they took these 800 and some individuals and they put them into the study, and then they followed them for the next 32 years and documented what they observed. This is a very powerful study. And they broke them into three groups. They looked at three measures of childhood adversity: overt physical or sexual abuse, neglect, severe neglect, or socioeconomic deprivation, severe poverty. If you had none of those three, you're represented in the blue bar. If you had one of those three, you're in the green bar. If you have two or more of those three, you're in the gray bar. And then they followed them over the next 32 years to see who actually developed depression. And if you had none of those adversities, then you had about a 12% chance, 12% of them developed depression. If you had one of those three, 20% developed depression. If you had two or more, 30% developed depression. And then they looked at C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation. And you'll notice if you had one or two, about 20% had inflammation. But if you had, 0 or 1, 20% had inflammation. But if you had two or more, over 30% had inflammatory problems. And then they looked at clustering of metabolic risk markers. Now, clustering of metabolic risk markers means obesity, diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, those problems. And you'll notice over here, again, what do we have? 12% with no risk, none of the childhood adversity, 12% had metabolic problems. 20% had metabolic problems if they had one childhood adversity, 30% if they had two or more. What is this telling us is that childhood experiences alter the physiology, both mental and physical. And so adults who are abused as children have higher rates of medical illnesses, higher rates of mental illnesses, higher rates of suicide, higher rates of alcohol and drug problems than if they had not been abused. When kids are abused, it actually alters the structure of the brain, and they end up with different brains than had they not been abused. But this is all kind of negative. Let's look at some positive things. Now, they took these mice and they actually genetically engineered them to be stupid. They genetically engineered them to have severe memory problems. And these are all clones now, so they're all going to have the same genetics. And then they took a group of them when they were adolescents and they put them in an enriched environment for 2 weeks. Now, this is what an enriched environment looks like to a mouse, okay? This has lots of things to explore and lots of textures to touch and things to go through. So you get all these cool little things to play on and stuff in their 2 weeks of adolescence. Now, not surprising, those who had the 2 weeks of this enhanced environment had improved memory when compared to clones, the exact clone, that didn't have the enriched environment. That doesn't surprise anybody, does it? That's not surprising. Here's where it gets interesting. The offspring of those who came out of this environment had improved memory despite the same genetic defect, and they were not given an enriched environment. You following what happened here? Okay? These mice, because of their rich environment, they had epigenetic modification of that gene that caused this memory problem, shut the gene off, the rich environment did. They had better memory, and then when they had kids, they passed along this defective gene, but they passed along the epigenetic instruction to say, don't turn the gene on, so the kids with the bad gene still had good memory. Isn't that cool? Yeah, and this is where it happened. A histone acetylation happened because of the enriched environment. It caused the histones in the region of that bad gene to be acetylated, little chemical groups locked on there, and prevented the gene from being expressed. So they have they have better memory now. Now, what would happen? This is. I hope your minds are pulling out of some things the Bible has taught us about these things. I'll come to it in a minute. But what happens if these kids then have very neglected environments? Or these kids get more nurturing and enriched environments. You see, it passes down. These acetyl groups are not permanently attached there. They can be removed by traumatic and stress environments. And so a kid with this bad gene could actually, by neglect, by not having good enriched environment themselves, could actually have those removed and actually get dumber, have more memory problems. Protective factors. Family member confident. Dr. Markham talked about the importance of relationships. They're critical. Healthy relationships are protective. Kids who grow up in a home where they have a family member confidant, somebody they can actually feel they can open themselves up to and talk to, have significantly reduced risk of behavior problems and emotional problems by the time they're 18. And the young ladies that have that family member confidant have higher self-esteem, reduced risks of major mental illnesses, and less risk of depression and drug problems and so forth. And then family cohesion, a family that has each other's back, a family that protects each other, a family that nurtures each other, rather than a family in conflict, is actually also very protective. Kids in those families do better in school. They become more successful in society. They have less mental health problems, less drug problems. Relationships are healing. Conflictual relationships, what part of the brain do you think gets fired? The stress circuits, and all that inflammatory cascade comes along. And we get worse physical health, and we get worse mental health. What about other environmental factors? Well, tobacco. Tobacco binds to nicotine receptors that regulate neurodevelopment, so teens who smoke have higher rates of psychosis, higher rates of agoraphobia, that's fear of going out in public, so they isolate themselves, higher rates of panic, higher rates of depression, they die younger from medical problems, and they have more difficult time quitting, because what happens to the brain in the developmental stage, remember I told you there's that neurogenesis, that wave of new neurons that hit in girls at 11 and boys at age 12, and then there's this process of neuronal pruning that happens. And if you start smoking in that process, you actually train your reward centers to be much more addicted to the nicotine than if you would have started smoking in your 20s. So it's much harder to get off if you started smoking in your teens. Alcohol, average age of first drink in Americans, age 12. Do you know that? The average age in America today, first alcoholic drink is age 12. 20% of teens between 12 and 20, it's 1 in 5, are binge drinkers, drinking to the point of intoxication and passing out. Adolescent drinkers scored worse than non-users on vocabulary, general information, memory retrieval, and at least 3 other cognitive tests. Alcohol impairs brain function. They perform worse in school, are more likely to fall behind, have increased risk of social impairments, depression, suicidal thoughts, acting out violently. Alcohol affects the sleep cycles, altering normal sleep architecture, and impaired memory, learning. And alcohol use increases the risk of stroke among young drinkers. Now, this alcohol also alters the epigenetics. You don't have to read all this detail, but the bottom line is this. When somebody is drinking and intoxicated, a Y protein is expressed that causes a person's amygdala to relax and feel at ease, and you feel chilling. But then, in the withdrawal state, as the alcohol clears, this Y protein is suppressed, and you get increasing anxiety, increasing apprehension, which makes you think, wow, I need my alcohol. So you're actually causing genes to alter that increases the likelihood you're going to go back and get more alcohol when you drink. What about marijuana? Dr. Markham said earlier about medicine and how medicine, historically, we look back and we find things that they did in the past that really, can we even say they were stupid? Leeching people with infection, cigarette smokes for lung disease. I mean, that's really not very bright, is it? Well, I'm going to tell you, this is one of the things that's happening in society, in America today. There are at least 3 states out west that you can get a prescription and a little license where you can get your medical marijuana. And I consult with a group in Washington State, and I've had patients come for mental health problems, and some doctor has given a prescription for medical marijuana. This is like giving somebody with emphysema cigarette smoke. It is devastating to the brain. Marijuana impairs prefrontal cortex function. It takes away creativity. It takes away drive. It takes away self-governance. It takes away motivation. It creates a sense of apathy. You can't get, and I've talked to these teens, you can't get well if you're smoking marijuana. It'd be like telling somebody who's got lung problems, smoking 2 packs a day, and they tell me that cigarettes help them breathe better. You can't get well if you're smoking 2 packs a day. It can't happen. So increased risk of psychotic disorder. Multiple studies show if you smoke marijuana, you're going to have a 40% increased likelihood of developing a psychotic disorder. Damages the white matter tracts in the brain, so impairs prefrontal cortex function. And a recent study showed that people who smoke marijuana in their teen years, before the age of 18, have an 8-point drop in IQ that never fully comes back. Now, let me tell you, the median IQ is 100. That puts you at the 50th percentile, meaning that you're right in the middle. 49% of people are below you, 49% of people are less. It's a 50th percentile. 8-point drop in IQ drops you to 92, which puts you at the 29th percentile. You've gone from 50 to 29. Think about your ability to succeed in the workforce, in school, to live independently. I mean, you've just killed yourself. 8-point drop in IQ. Section 3, media influences. Babies under 1 watch approximately 1 hour more of TV a day. 7 studies have now confirmed that any amount of television watching of any kind impairs language development. That's why baby Einstein is gone. You remember baby Einstein? Buy this, let your kid watch it, going to have your baby become really smart real quick? No. Studies show you let your baby watch that. Any television watching under the age of 2 delays language development. So the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Family Practice, and others recommend 0 television watching of any kind for kids under the age of 2. There are no studies that show TV watching of educational material has any benefit under the age of 2. Children get greater than 6 hours per day of electronic media, TV, video games, computers, text, tweets, cell phones. 50% of teens have a TV in their room. American teen watches, by the time they're 18, over 200,000 acts of violence on television. They watch 15,000 sexual acts per year on TV, 2,000 beer and wine commercials per year. Children don't differentiate between reality and TV. They can't distinguish the qualitative difference. So if it's on TV, it must be reliable, it must be trustworthy, it must be good information. It becomes assimilated into their beliefs and practices. Media constantly normalizes and bombards teen with sex. And teens think, well, it's normal. Everybody's doing it. What's wrong with me? I should be doing it too. And teen programming has more sexual content than adult programming, but most of it's not responsible. Less than 10% actually shows any type of responsible behavior. So television impact on the brain. Well, remember the normal process of brain development. What's happening in normal brain development? We've got all these neurons. We have more than we need. There's a process of remodeling going on. Neurons that are not being used are being deleted. Neurons that are being used are being expanded and strengthened. And then think, what is theatrical television? We're talking now theatrical television, not educational television once you're over the age of 2. So theatrical television has as its primary effect on the brain to activate these lower mood circuits. Think about it. It wants to get you to laugh, wants to get you to cry, wants to get you afraid, wants to get you stressed, wants to get you aroused. In other words, theatrical television is trying to get an emotional reaction out of you, and the bigger the emotional reaction, the better the programming, right? While it simultaneously turns off the prefrontal cortex where you reason and think. And if you don't believe this is happening when you watch theatrical television, next time you turn on your favorite show, I dare you to start thinking, hey, what's the likelihood this could happen in real life? Do you think it's really possible this guy could have been 50 yards ahead of him when they were around this corner? We come around the corner, now they're only 3 feet from each other. Do you really think that, you watch the show and start thinking, and you're going to go, this show's stupid. It's not going to be fun anymore. You're not going to like it. The only way you can enjoy it is to not think. So think now through the process, what that means neurobiologically. Exercising these neurons hours and hours a day. These neurons are not being exercised hours and hours a day. What do you think is going to happen to a developing brain? Well, the seminal study done on this was done by Dr. Centerwall, published in the Journal of American Medical Association back in 1992, I believe. Yeah, 92. And he wanted to see if there's a relationship between television watching and violence in society. And he used a black and white indicator of violence, which was homicide rates in society. And he picked 3 societies, Canada, the United States, and South Africa. He chose these 3 because Canada and the United States, television came into our society in 1945. South Africa did not come in, no television in the whole country until 1974. Now, he added Canada because Canada has very strict gun control laws, and if we did see an increase in homicide over the course of time, he did not want people to say, well, that's too easy access to guns in America. So he added Canada as a comparator. And in South Africa, he looked at white-on-white only homicide to take out all the apartheid issues that might contaminate the issues as well. And this is what he discovered. From 1945 to 1974, homicide rates in the United States increased by 93%, in Canada by 92%, and in South Africa during the same time, they dropped by 7%. But here's the kicker. Then he looked at homicide rates in South Africa from 1974 to 1987, white on white only, and they jumped 130% after the introduction of television. Now, a lot of people believe that the primary issue with television watching is content. As long as they're watching G-rated programming, you're okay. It's the violent programming, the R-rated programming that causes the problems. That's where you get into trouble. Well, let me ask you, what was the television programming on in America between 1945 and 1974? Leave It to Beaver, Howdy Doody, Ozzie and Harriet, Car 54, Lassie, The Lone Ranger, okay? What do all of these programs get rated? G rating, 92, 93% rise in homicides with G-rated programming. Now, did the programming get worse after 1974? We got 130% rise. Content is a magnifier. It does have an effect. I'm not diminishing the importance of content. It's important, but it's not primary. What's primary is neurobiological. Television watching is changing the structure of the brain. You're getting an overdeveloped mood circuitry, an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex circuitry. So when you hit adolescence and the hormones now inflame those moods, you have a prefrontal cortex that is unprepared to process that stimuli, modulate that stimuli, calm and hold in check. And so adolescents will become more violent, they'll act out, they're more moody, they're more irritable, they'll look to alcohol and drugs to calm themselves because they can't, because their prefrontal cortex is not built to do so. Well, this was followed up with a study by 2007 by Zimmerman and Christaki, and they looked at this very question. Violent theatrical programming, R-rated, versus nonviolent, G-rated, versus educational programming. And what they're looking for here is attention problems, ADHD type issues, prefrontal cortex impairment is what they're looking at. And what they found was that theatrical programming, regardless, R-rated or G-rated, had the same impact, causing the same attention problems. Educational program did not cause that. So again, this is neurobiological. So why more TV, more violence? Because you lose the governor, the self-restrainer. You overdevelop the impulse circuits. Why more promiscuity? Because of the same reason. Why more attention problems? Same reason, neurobiologic changes. So spiritual factors. Meditation impact on the brain. Multiple studies have shown that any form of contemplative meditation is beneficial to both physical and mental health. Contemplative meaning a focused, calming meditation. And the reason for that, neurobiologically speaking, if you do this type of meditation, it requires the activation of certain circuits in the prefrontal cortex, which calms and turns off the amygdala, calming that inflammatory cascade. However, what showed the greatest benefit was when people meditated on a God of love. So any form of the mind emptying type of things, well, this is clearly better than letting fears and all types of scary things run through your mind constantly and worries and all this kind of quieting the mind, even if it's thinking on nothing, is better than focusing on all the stressful stuff. But it's not as good as focusing on a God of love. Focusing on a God of love was the most healing, and in the study of patients 65 years and older, they had them meditate 12 minutes a day for 30 days on a God of love. And at the end of those 30 days, they could notice growth in the anterior cingulate cortex. That's where you experience compassion and empathy and where you make decisions. Growth was measurable on an MRI scan of the brain. And that's this part of the brain here, anterior cingulate cortex, growth in 30 days. And calming of the amygdala as evidenced by lower blood pressure, lower heart rate, and they had a 30% improvement in standardized memory testing. All within 30 days of meditating on a God of love. Now here's where it really gets interesting. Every other God concept, angry God, wrathful God, punitive God, distant God, uncaring God, no growth in the anterior cingulate cortex, no improvement in memory, no lowering of heart rate, no lowering of blood pressure, no benefit. If you don't meditate on a God of love, you don't get the benefit. So spiritual factors, activities which improve prefrontal cortex function and anterior cingulate cortex function and calm amygdala circuits are healthy and healing, those fear circuits. So you think about this. Meditating on a God of love activates the anterior cingulate cortex, calms the amygdala, which is the fear circuitry, perfect love casting out fear. You see how that works? Isn't that cool? Neurobiologically, it's true. But activities, religious beliefs that incite fear are damaging. Damaging to relationships because they undermine trust, damaging to the body because they cause inflammation, damaging to the brain, and we'll explain how inflammation damages the brain this afternoon. So, God constructs that are loving or healing, all of the God constructs are damaging. So now question, which is more scientifically accurate, Charles Darwin or the Bible? Charles Darwin or the Bible, scientifically accurate. Well, this is a picture of Darwin's finches, adaptive radiation. His theory, when he looked at the finches, you'll notice the different beaks on all these finches. And his theory was that because of environmental need and adaptation, that the radiation caused mutations such that some of these birds were more built for buds and fruit, some for seeds, some for leaves, some for insects, and so forth. And all of these beak changes came through mutation of the genetic sequence that happened over millions of years. Well, in actuality, this has been proven. You don't have to read this whole thing. I just put it up here so you have it in your notes. But all these finches, same exact DNA sequence, no mutation. They have epigenetic modification that happens within 1 to 2 generations based on environmental exposure. Just what the Bible teaches. Mankind was created to procreate beings in his image. We were created with freedom to make choices. And as we make those choices, we alter ourselves, altering our own DNA expression, and we pass along to our kids the instructions that make them more like us. That's a scary thing, isn't it? Yes, it is. We are born in sin, conceived in iniquity. According to Psalms, we pass along those fears and insecurities we're born with, and destructive choices change us, passing down 3 to 4 generations. As the Bible says, the sins are passed down 3 to 4 generations. Just as we've looked at all these epigenetic modifications, they get passed down through the generations. Yet God has mercy on 1,000 generations of those who love him. So how do we put this together? So I hope you see, first off, the Bible is more scientifically accurate than Darwin. Darwin was wrong, Bible's right. Second, what does all this mean? Our choices change us. The choices you make will change you. A lot of kids, parents, grandparents, going to talk to your kids or grandkids in their teen years, and they say stuff like, hey, it's my body, I can do what I want with it. Only if you're planning on never having kids. If you're planning on having kids, it's not your body, it's your kids, your grandkids, and your great-grandkids as well. You're messing with them as well. Unhealthy choices damage and destroy, and we pass those along to our descendants. But what does hating God have to do with passing iniquity to later generations versus mercy on those who love God? It's very, very simple, really. Is eternal healing, is this a promise for eternal healing in the future of eternity only? Or is God making a promise for healing that can happen and start now? Love calms the amygdala, grows the anterior cingulate cortex. This is epigenetic change, which heals. And we pass along those positive changes as well. However, hate activates the amygdala, causes more inflammation, causes more physical and mental health problems, and causes more trust and distrust problems. So God can't heal people who hate him, but he can heal people who love and trust him. Healthy brain development is optimized by healthy parents. First and foremost, physical and mentally healthy parents. If you want to have healthy kids, the best thing you do is do everything you can to get yourself healthy. That's the best thing you can do. Live a healthy life. You're a young person, you want to have healthy kids one day, live a healthy life. And put yourself in a position to have healthy kids. Healthy intrauterine environment. If you're pregnant, don't smoke, don't drink, don't do drugs. Eat healthy foods. Don't be stressed. Spiritual meditation and worship. Don't watch a lot of television, because when you watch television, especially scary stuff, it causes a release of glucocorticoids. And those glucocorticoids will penetrate the placental barrier, will alter the developing fetus if you're doing this. Proper nutrition, healthy diet, affection, parents that attend and nurture the child. We saw how that alters the developing brain for healthier brains. These kids will be less fearful, less insecure. Physical activity. Physical activity is critical to normal brain development. This is, you probably all heard of the cerebellum. The cerebellum, the part of the brain that coordinates motor movement. We've now discovered that the cerebellum not only helps coordinate smooth motor movement, but the cerebellum has evolved in coordinating and organizing smooth thinking. This is one of the great dysfunctions or mistakes I think we're making in education when we're taking away physical, PE, recess, and we're just doing in this classroom all day long. The kids need to get out and play. They need to develop their bodies. They need to develop their motor circuits, because motor circuits help the thinking circuits work better. A stimulation of the five senses. We need to develop all of those senses, and we'll explain the importance of that later. Avoidance of toxic substances, a good education. Education requires lots of neurons to recruit, expand the network to get more complex. Avoidance of theatrical entertainment, or at least minimizing the theatrical entertainment. Healthy spirituality, and that includes not just worshiping a God of love, but acting in love. Giving of yourself to help and bless others. We'll give you some more data on that when we get into some other lectures today. Resolving guilt and forgiving those who do you wrong. Chronic guilt and chronic resentment fire amygdala, keeping the inflammatory cascade going. And then healthy sleep. Dr. Markham pointed out the importance of sleep. So summary, the brain is highly complex and susceptible to change. Environment causes marked changes in brain development, and environment alters gene expression and is passed down through the generations. Following God's methods as described in Scripture promotes a healthy brain. And it's time now for our first break. So we're coming back in 15 minutes? Yep, 15 minutes, we're going to start our next talk. Thank you.